The music of Bach taps into an emotional depth.
Look, it's the most human music that I know. You could look at it and see all the counterpoint and the harmony, and it looks very technical and kind of mathematical, and I suppose it is that, but that's all in service of basic expression, basic human expression in the most profound and direct way.
It is human. It is very human. Like it resonates with human nature.
He's a very special composer because he has a real range of abilities that make it so he can depict almost any aspect of the human experience.
You don't have to, I don't think, relate to it on a personally spiritual level to understand the spirituality that's behind it, and just be taken by the humanity that is behind all of his compositions and the glory of it. I don't know how you can miss that.
Hi, my name is Nicholas Pon, and this is the Bach 52 project. This week's guest is oboist and artistic director of Les Délices, Debra Nagy. Debra is a longtime colleague and friend. We've performed many times all over the United States together, performing all sorts of Baroque repertoire, including the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Based in Cleveland, Les Délices is an ensemble that has a wonderful web series called Salon Era that mixes music and conversation, not unlike the Bach 52 project. If I'm being completely honest, part of the inspiration for this project and the format of this project came from Debra's vision for Salon Era. So I'm really grateful to her and her colleagues at Les Délices for partnering with me on these first 3 episodes of Bach 52. Debra flew out to San Francisco in September of 2022 to film 6 arias with me, and you'll hear the first of these on this episode this evening. The first aria of these 6 is from Cantata 166, Ich will an den Himmel denken. My chat with Debra was fascinating. We talked not only about what drew her to early music and Baroque music and learning how to play these historical instruments, but we also talked about why she thinks there's something in Bach that is potentially relatable for everyone. You know, the question we're examining with Bach 52 is basically, do you think the music of Bach is for everyone? So let's start there and see where this conversation goes.
I feel like it is potentially relatable for everyone on some level. For myself, I obviously am not a native German speaker, for instance. I am not from Christian tradition, let alone German Lutheran tradition. So that may or may not be a point of remove. But I feel like the emotion and some of the larger kind of meta ideas and sentiment are universally relatable. It was interesting, I found myself reflecting and thinking about, some major, I wouldn't say aha moments, but some moments where Bach's music, whether I'm listening to it or in the midst of performing it, has, really touched me, or when there have been some additional resonances. And I think that one of the things that's amazing about Bach, and I don't mean to get macabre here, but there are the most fascinating and deep and beautiful and centering messages about mortality. And, whether that, is, the one moment in the St. John Passion where I always cry, or doing Seufzertränen and thinking about recent losses in my life or the lives of loved ones. It's very, very deep and very impactful. And I don't have to be a believer, and I don't have to speak German and or any of those things in order to feel those feelings.
So tell us a little bit about your relationship with Bach. I mean, how did it begin? How has it evolved over the course of your career?
Being that I play the oboe, my relationship with Bach is a pretty intimate and important one. The real golden age of the oboe, and when I say the oboe, I speak generally of the instrument, not necessarily the Baroque oboe or the modern oboe, but for oboists in general, the music of Bach and really the 18th century is the golden age. Since I became remotely serious about the oboe, which is to say like in high school, I was aware and I was already taking advantage of this very rich repository of repertoire in the Baroque period. My teacher, who was kind of my surrogate mother from, when I started with her in 4th grade until I graduated from high school, actually considered herself a Baroque specialist. And rather than playing etudes and God knows what all the way through high school, she was developing my technique playing sonatas by Telemann and Handel and Bach. So I was absorbing so much of this language and rhetoric without even totally knowing it. And when the opportunity came up when I was in my undergraduate, a student at the Oberlin Conservatory, to experiment with Baroque oboe, what was an experiment became an absolute passion and obsession, if you will. I mean, in a way, recognizing that there was an extraordinary amount of repertoire that I could kind of not just discover, but rediscover in a whole different way with an instrument that would bear different and arguably richer fruit expressively, specifically in that repertoire. So, by the time I returned to Telemann and Handel and Bach on a Baroque oboe, I felt like I was, in a way, being enabled to reach a whole nother level. I remember hearing that very first week that I was playing the Baroque oboe, hearing the Christmas oratorio for the first time, which is also an absolute tour de force for the oboe. I had played obligato cantatas on obligato arias by Bach on modern oboe and things like that, but the relationship between the voice and this very, very vocal instrument in quality, the Baroque oboe, or the Baroque oboe d'amore, was just so arresting, and I needed to do more of it. And here we are, 20 years later.
Yeah, here we are. So tell us a little bit about the difference between a modern oboe and a Baroque oboe, and then, the difference between the oboe and the oboe d'amore, because we recorded arias with both of those instruments this week.
So the difference between a modern oboe and a Baroque oboe, first of all, a modern oboe has about 26 keys on it, and the Baroque oboe has a grand total of 2. The way that keys functioned originally on a period instrument of any kind is that you only have keys generally to act as an extension of the hand, which is to say to open or close holes that you could not reach otherwise. Mm-hmm. Whereas those 26 keys on a modern oboe, I could press a key down here and it can open holes up here. And the whole idea behind all of those keys is to make the notes sound as much the same as possible. Now, if I were to play, say, a chromatic scale on the Baroque oboe, which is not something that I'm almost ever called upon to do because it's extremely unnatural, you would hear how different the quality of each note is, and particularly the notes that roughly correspond to the black notes on the keyboard. Notes like that are what we call cross-fingered notes, which is to say I'm cutting the bore of the instrument in a funny place, and the modern oboe cuts the bore at the exact right place and has a key open or close. What happens then with the Baroque oboe is that the sound quality is covered and soft, and then in order to deal with these kind of inequalities between the notes, you end up needing to have a reed which is very flexible. Also, you can't, there's no octave key, so you also have to have this very refined control over how you use your air, not unlike a singer or even a trumpet player, in order to basically voice all these notes differently. So the result is that you have an instrument that is, in a way, more flexible, where you use your wind very differently, not just to voice notes, but that becomes a potentially different sort of expressive device, and playing in different tonalities or keys. One sounds very different from another. So, and this is a good way to segue from Baroque oboe to oboe d'amore. The Baroque oboe is essentially a flat key instrument, which is to say it sounds great and feels best playing in flat keys, which is why the arias that we recorded together, one of them is in G minor with 2 flats. The other one is in C minor with 3 flats. And those are like the 2 best solo keys, or most common solo keys for the Baroque oboe. But what you'd never see for the oboe is a solo in D major with 2 sharps. And you never see a solo in A major in 2 sharps for the oboe. In fact, for Bach, we have a whole nother instrument to do that, and that is the oboe d'amore. The oboe d'amore is, if the oboe is in C, the home key of the oboe d'amore is A major. So if that is my home key, I can, travel away from that home key and further and further sharpward. So, there's no mistake that the pieces that we recorded with the oboe d'amore were in F sharp minor and B minor and C sharp minor, which are sort of like keys with unthinkable numbers of sharps, at least to people who specialize in period instruments. I can't even think about double sharps and kind of comprehend that. But that is the kind of lingua franca and the kind of home for an oboe d'amore. And the oboe d'amore is very special and very particular to the music of Bach. It is an instrument that was very geographically limited. It only existed it was invented around 1718 or so. And so when Bach gets to do his audition in Leipzig, that's his first opportunity really to write for oboe d'amore, and he takes advantage of these instruments that are only available locally. And so you see really important parts for oboe d'amore in the works of Bach from 1722, 1723 onwards. The only other composers that write for oboe d'amore are specific to that northern Germany, and it's like just Telemann, Graupner, Graun, and that's about it. And it's an instrument that doesn't really exist after 1750. What does the music of Bach mean to me, and what is it like for my instrument? Well, it's a super rich repertoire, and it's also very specialized in that way.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. It's interesting singing these pieces with modern oboe versus the Baroque oboe.
What's that experience like for you?
It's interesting. Like orchestra's tuned to a modern oboe because the reasons you were describing, like the pitch is evened out and it's very pure. Mm-hmm. And so you can always tune to this very pure tone.
It cuts through them. The modern oboe is built to penetrate.
Yeah. And like having evened out the instrument in terms of just making all the pitches sound the same, it's just always super in tune. And so it feels in a way, there's the challenge of being at the higher pitch, which modern instruments are playing at A equals 440, Baroque instruments at A equals 415. So we're down a half step. There's a kind of warmer, richer sound that makes things easier, but also the Baroque oboe, because it has that sort of uneven quality of tone between the pitches, it feels like there's more color for the voice to respond to. And it gives you just a little bit more room to breathe and be a little flexible. And I feel like it opens up a kind of human sound to his music, whereas with modern instruments, it does start to, particularly the oboe, it can sound, it's still beautiful and it's still gorgeous and it should be played on these instruments too, but it just sounds a little bit more precise in a way.
I think that's partly aesthetic of modern performance practice, but I think it is also partly how the modern oboe functions, which is to say it's a highly, highly pressurized situation, and you need to maintain a very fast airspeed all the time on the modern oboe. And, one of the great joys and also frustrations for beginners of the Baroque oboe is that there are all these variable airspeeds that you use because the notes are all different, have different resistances because of the fingerings, or because you have to be able to manipulate which octave you're playing in, and so many other things. But being able to use variable wind speeds, to me also equates to more varied expression.
Yeah. It's like a bigger color palette somehow. And it makes it feel a little less sterile in some ways, to me, as a singer.
Well, I enjoy it, obviously.
Me too. It's interesting, you found this life passion for, and your sort of life's calling in a way, through these particular instruments and also this music, it sounds like. I mean, Christmas oratorio is like a transformative experience for you, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And has that continued to evolve over time since that moment?
I think that, one of the things that we're hearing from so many artists as they approach Bach is how infinitely challenging that music is, that you feel like your work is never done, but also how enriching the things that you notice for the first time, no matter how many times you have the opportunity to perform a given work. And the fact of the matter is, there are so many works by Bach that we don't hear often enough or on a regular basis.
There's so many, even just for our individual instruments, and it's like this treasure trove that you can kind of keep diving into, and they are demanding, and so there are constantly new layers to discover. So part of the thing that's really, the thing that is really inspiring me to kind of ask this question of his music is the religiosity of these texts. And I was introduced to Bach's music as a player. I was a violin player when I was a kid, and I was Suzuki Book 4. You start to play the Bach double. I played, E major concerto and the A minor concerto, and you study these things as a student. And I remember specifically the double concerto in D minor. I was, got to Book 4 in Suzuki, played that second violin part, and I was hooked. And then when I made this transition to being a singer, I eventually encountered his music again, and I didn't really think much about it until I think I did my first St. Matthew Passion. And, we're doing this piece that is so really, it's really the centerpiece of Christianity, the story, crucifixion and passion of Jesus. And, I was seeing how much space we create in the secular space. It was in a concert hall. People are coming there for, nearly 4 hours of their evening to listen to this music. And it started making me think, all of his music is really deeply religious. He signs every piece Soli Deo Gloria, only for the glory of God, which, as an artist, that's certainly something I can appreciate and admire, this idea that you're doing something in service of something larger than yourself. But the Christianity aspect of it seems like such a limiting factor, and yet this music is so revered and loved by so many different people. And so I just wonder, you said you weren't obviously raised a German Lutheran, so
Indeed.
What were you raised?
I was raised conservative Jewish.
Oh, wow.
And I, at this point, identify as culturally Jewish. I am not practicing. My own personal beliefs, are somewhere on a continuum between agnostic and atheist. Probably closer to atheist, which doesn't mean that I don't believe in humanity and empathy and feeling, which is what, for me, the passions become about. I can sing along with all the arias. And at least in the John, I can mouth most of the words and understand most of the words in the Evangelist Recit. And I almost inevitably cry at Es ist vollbracht, in part because I realized the loss of a best friend in the middle of Es ist vollbracht one time. And so I can't go through that experience without thinking of that person and that moment. So, I feel like there are any number of resonances that we may have that are independent of being believers. I don't have significant opinions, quite honestly, about, for instance, discussion of anti-Semitism in the St. John Passion in particular, though I hear the anger and I hear the emotion, and Bach didn't write any operas. These turbochoruses are as close as we come, and the range of human emotion from joy to grief to anger to jubilation is complete, and that Bach brings all of that to us in turn. I'd love to ask you if you have a formative moment or memory or piece with Bach.
I have a few. That first time I did the St. Matthew Passion, I remember sitting in a sort of dress rehearsal before the first performance. It was with Jane Glover, music of the Baroque, so it was modern instruments.
Mm-hmm.
And I was singing the tenor arias, so I was able to kind of step out into the house and, just observe the piece from afar as we ran it that night. And I remember the soprano getting to Aus Liebe and it just hitting me and dawning on me that two things. A, that beautiful message of Jesus is doing all of this out of his love for humanity. He is sacrificing himself and undergoing all of this passion and, pathos, suffering for mankind to save us from ourselves. That was kind of, I was raised in the Greek Orthodox Church. Again, I don't know where I fall on belief. Mm-hmm. In these days, I would say I'm pretty agnostic in the sense that I believe in something larger than us. What is that? I have no idea. I think it's kind of presumptuous to assume that we could ever possibly understand that as human beings. And if we could understand it, I don't know, that would be a good thing. Mm-hmm. But that notion of love and compassion and sacrifice for the community and the greater good, and even when people are being at their worst, that was a really moving moment for me. And then the other thing in that moment was I was listening to her sing and it dawned on me for the first time, even though I had studied the piece and whatnot, that the story ends before you get to the resurrection. It ends with his burial. And there was something about that for me that made me realize this story is a very human story. It's an extremely human story up until we get to, a bunch of Marys coming to this tomb and there's nobody there except for a couple of angels. That's where it starts to veer off into the supernatural and the sort of mythological and, belief situation. But up until there, we're just dealing with the story of a martyr.
And what I, as someone who's playing Aus Liebe in the Matthew Passion, am thinking about and relating to in that moment is, and it's what I find generally fascinating in the music of Bach, is various elements of dichotomy and psychology. So Aus Liebe, as anyone who's listening will recall, is for soprano, flute, and 2 oboes da caccia, and no one else and nothing else. There is no other harmony. And so it's actually this extraordinarily fragile and vulnerable and naked state in addition to being an an expression of love and sacrifice.
Right. And
So-
you have this beautiful flute line that's playing this gorgeous melody, but then the oboes are punctuating it with these very short things that are like nails in a cross. I mean, like it's almost as if they're being pounded in. And so you have this, there's something horrifying to me about the starkness and the sort of dichotomy between those two, those parts in the instrumental writing. And it was that was part of what contributed to that moment. The other moment that was more recent for me that was sort of like, oh, wow, like epiphanic moment about Bach's music was recently, actually, I was in Columbus earlier this spring. So by the time this airs, last year. And we were doing the St. John Passion, and it was those turba choruses, the crowd scenes. And I was thinking a little bit about, they had done the pre-concert panel discussion with the rabbi and the priest and the whoever, talking about, is this anti-Semitic? And sort of examining that question. And I was mulling on that in that performance. I had this moment where it just made me, I realized because of the way Bach structures things, he takes other parts from the Matthew Passion and inserts them into the narrative, into the John Passion narrative in order to flesh out the John Passion. But there's also something very intentional about that to me that is really trying to drive home this point that it's these people who are so angry, even though St. John is identifying them as Jews the entire time, Bach is also saying, those people are us. And in this current climate of cancel culture and sort of, public tarring and feathering of people on social media for whatever misstep someone has made for political reasons or whatnot, and this sort of kind of being pushed everything into a sort of black and white binary in terms of our political discourse. There was something about those scenes that feels very of the moment and sort of the timelessness of it all, this idea that people who are daring to speak their truth, whatever that is, oftentimes, get consumed and sacrificed as scapegoats. It's kind of the thing that sort of perpetuates the cycle of it all. I mean, we're willing to take the most precious things to us and cancel them, or, I don't like that term really, but.
No, but you make an interesting point, and actually, these days when I listen to the Passions, actually, the character and the characterization that I often find myself most compelled by is Pilate, who goes through this whole psychological transformation and trying to understand his role in the course of the trial, and really whether he's doing the right thing by listening to the crowd. For me, it's mostly mythology, but we are storytellers. Bach is a great storyteller in multiple modes in this way, and we learn not only what he may have been thinking or what his interpretation might be, but also we learn about ourselves and humanity and history along the way. And one last story, since you told this story of playing the Bach double, and from Suzuki, I made me realize actually that, one of my very most important and formative experiences with the music of Bach was learning the oboe violin double.
Oh,
when
that
I was
concerto.
Still in high school, with a good friend, and I went over to her house every single week, and for months we were preparing it, for the concerto competition and in the youth orchestra. And there's no professional situation where you would have the opportunity to rehearse a concerto with a fellow soloist for months on end. But, in thinking about that experience, we had the opportunity to come to know that piece so deeply, to discuss every phrase and every inflection, to be able to explore musical dialogue and the slow movement, in a way that is sort of unheard of. And, I could say something goofy like Bach builds community, but it absolutely did for me in that instance, and I think it does for us more generally, where we can sit and talk about our experiences playing this or that passion or cantata or concerto or suite or solo, and connect with some kind of, for lack of a better word, universal experience.
Yeah. I mean, he was composing all of this in service of the community ultimately. And so, I mean, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you so much for doing this. This has been such a joy.
Fab. One of the arias that Nick and I recorded in September 2022 was the aria Ich will an den Himmel denken from Cantata 166, Wo gehst du hin? The aria is a pledge that during my time on earth, I will focus my thoughts towards heaven. The aria actually survives in an incomplete form, with just the oboe, tenor, and continuo parts surviving. The violin part has been reconstructed, but as you can hear, the imitation in the violin is extremely natural. For me, the aria's A section, full of suspensions, musical sighs, and a meandering bass line, signals tension, inner conflict, and indecision. But I love the contrast in the B section. While the text basically asks, should I go or stay? Bach composes resolute traveling music full of ascending scales for both bass and voice.
So liegt mir die Frag im Sinn. und der Welt mein Herz nicht mein Herz nicht schenken.